Deb Rooney from the Department of Learning Health Sciences and the Clinical Simulation Center for the University of Michigan. Today's module will be talking about adapting performance assessment tools for your simulation-based program. Before getting started, I'd like to recognize the CERT program, the Center for International Reproductive Health Training at the University of Michigan, for their sponsorship in this module. Let's go ahead and get started. So primarily, you've got two things we're going to cover in this module. I'm going to review the considerations of adapting assessment tools for your own use, your own learners, your own unit, your own division, whatever it may be. And we're also going to review the steps used to adapt, yes, I'm saying adapt, the assessment tools for your own learners' needs. So we talked about those 5 steps, and we're going to go through each one, beginning with adopt versus adapt. Very rarely, let's just say, do we actually adopt an assessment tool from another program. What that means is we use it right out of the box as presented with no modifications or revisions. And I'm going to tell you that generally is not going to happen, or if it does, it's rare. So typically what we do is we adapt assessment tools, almost always for our own setting, our training situation, the technologies used, or our own learners. So yes, we can think that we're going to adopt, and almost always we will adapt to make it fit our own needs. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with this first step, creating an assessment plan. Now, many of us might remember that learning objectives are the foundation of an assessment plan, and I'm always going to refer back to that. They are based on Bloom's taxonomy, and we'll get a little bit deeper into this. Today, because we're talking about psychomotor, we're actually talking about skills. There are other types of learning domains, such as cognitive and affective, but again, like I said, we'll be targeting psychomotor skills, and therefore the S of the KSA. Now, many of us have seen the pyramids associated with Bloom's taxonomy, especially with the cognitive learning domain, but here we have the psychomotor learning domain. And as a quick review, if we begin at the very bottom, the broadest base, we begin in psychomotor training, task training, by imitation. And this is basically learners watching and imitating their instructor. Quite simply, as they develop the skills and move up the pyramid, they become more steady, they become more precise, hence the darker orange in the middle. And then finally, as they reach the peak of the pyramid, it becomes second nature, hence naturalization. So this gives us an idea of the range of abilities that learners can have as they develop psychomotor skills. And we want to make sure that we are assessing this range fully, depending on what your learner's ability are in any given moment. Just wanted to be mindful of that. The other thing we need to talk about when we're planning our assessment plan is we need to actually determine the assessment purpose. Most folks have heard about formative and summative, but let's do a quick review. Formative, which is very commonly used in simulated setting because simulation is promoted to be a safe learning space without punitive impact. What it's used for is often with feedback. Learners are allowed to make mistakes without high consequences, and the feedback is the meat of what drives their performance improvements. Consequences are typically low, hence the name low stakes. Now, summative, typically this is done, and yes, it can be done in simulation setting. It's typically done at the end of a rotation, perhaps, or the end of a training cycle, and we want to make sure that someone can perform safe practice, safe patient care, and we need that demonstrated to ensure some kind of credentialing process or to ensure that they're ready to practice clinically, hence moderate or high stakes. These are the way that we think about these types of things. Now, if we put it all together, it's important to have this before we actually start considering different assessment tools. And I say this because sometimes we can be swayed by the availability of tools that we find. And so I like to have these decisions made a priori based on the strength of your faculty, your program director, your instructors, and the intended targets for your learners. Keeping these in mind, then we go out and move forward. So what I would suggest is have a document something like this. Most often they're a little more complicated than this, more than one learning objective typically. But write it down. Have it in your back pocket, and this is where your search for assessment tools begins. On to the next task, find your existing tools. Let's hope there are some. It makes life a little bit easier. So what I typically do is I look at all the resources I can, and there are many. Let's go ahead and start with associations. This is a common either clinical associations or social associations often will have online training programs or downloadable programs. For example, the two that I have here is the American College of Surgeons and also the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They have resources on both. As long as you can create a login and register, I believe these are no fee access, which is really nice, and that is one place that I go. And none of these, for the record, are in order of importance. Sometimes you look at all of them, sometimes you're lucky looking at some of them, but these are my main resources that I look at when I'm looking for different assessments. The next one that I look at are the curriculum portals. And what do I mean when I say this? The places that house curricula. For example, here are two. QSEN, which is Quality and Safety Education for Nurses. That predominantly is associated with curricula for policy change and safe practice in the clinical setting. It is a nice resource, though, and so they have certain curricula available online. The one that I mostly use is MedEd Portal, offered by AAMC, and we'll show you a little snippet of what that might look like. So here is what a screenshot looks like. And take our example. I'm going to use postpartum hemorrhage, or PPH, as an example. So I typed that in. I'm doing it I'm not doing it live for the sake of timing, but to save time. So here we have one result for PPH, and it's by Metzner et al., published in 2011. Now, the cool thing about this is if I were to go ahead and click on this obstetric bleeding curriculum, it has a full curriculum. It has everything from setup to the equipment required, to the roles of trainees, how you manage the rollout and administer the assessment, and of course the assessment tool. That's exactly what we're looking for. So here is that particular assessment tool, and we see that it's Appendix J, which means there's lots of other good stuff in this program. I'm just highlighting this for the sake of our assessment target. And here we see a multi-item checklist, and it seems to be a yes-no dichotomous. If it's checked, it's positive. If it's not checked, it's left undone. Here's the second page. Okay. Now we have other options too. We can go to search engines. There's Medline, there's Ovid, there's ERIC. My favorite, PubMed. We'll go ahead and look at that. But make sure that you consider other search engines beyond medicine. My first choice, though, I go to PubMed, and here's another example. Again, I typed in the search bar, PPH, and I got this hit. Fantastic. Go ahead and I opened it up. And here is the actual, I'm able to download the PDF, and within that PDF, oh my gosh, we do see a checklist, which is very different than the initial one found. So we might need to make some decisions about what factors and features of each checklist might benefit me. The interesting thing about this checklist is I see that items are weighted, and we also have kind of a complex scoring mechanism that allows for anchoring. It's a 3-point rating scale. The partially or incorrectly done option are all anchored based on that particular item, which is really nice, but can be kind of daunting for our assessment folks if they're not doing it consistently. So that's something to think about. Looking further, we have a few more places, resources that we can look at. SSH, or Society for Simulation in Healthcare. It's a nice resource. It's generally not my first choice, but occasionally they do have some really fantastic resources, particularly with the SIG groups, the special interest groups. So I'll point that out. And then finally, Odd places. This is kind of a weird bucket. The reason I'm calling it odd is sometimes it's in a happenstance. It just happens and there's an opportunity that comes up. I like to look at ResearchGate and some of these other science communities online, and I'll just check out people that I've read. I may go there and do a search for a particular person. That's really cool. Another really good resource, another odd place, is when you are doing performance assessment is associated with device development or device guidelines. And so sometimes, let's say you're doing a procedure, and we'll hit one up as an example, manual vacuum MVA, which we will hit up a little bit later as an example. That came from a use guideline for a device. So something to consider. Another option when we talked about weird places, your colleagues, your buddies, the people that you talk to, that you rub shoulder to shoulder with at conferences even. Fabulous place. This is where this one came from a colleague of mine, Dr. Hayes, who developed this 27-item checklist for, again, QBL. Oh my gosh, postpartum hemorrhage. We're right there. So this is fantastic. Dichotomously scored, pretty straight up, and we're going to use this as an example too. One thing that's nice about this dichotomously scored that we talked about, and it's either not done or done. Very clean in our assessment. Typically, it's done with a summative score. You add them all up, and you hit a pass-fail. If it's a mastery program, if it's a mastery planned program, you need 100% to get it done. Or it can be used formatively and used as a feedback loop to your learners. So now that we have these tools, what do we do with them? Well, we have to evaluate them. They're not good enough just because whoever developed them say they're good enough. So let's look at that. Here we have, for the sake of our exercise, 2 of these scales. The one on the left, this is Metzger's, I believe. It has a whole section on preoperative assessment. This is not what we have associated with our learning objectives. So I can automatically say, because I've determined it a priori, this is not important to me. So I'm going to ignore those items. Awesome. I read through it. Everything else looks relevant until we get to the back end where we talk about uterine atony. And perhaps, I'm not sure. So I might have to go talk to my colleagues and see if we might want to add these things. Maybe I didn't consider it. Maybe I really didn't write it in my learning objectives, but now I'm second guessing it, and I think I should. Sometimes it's okay to have a question mark. We'll talk about how we deal with that. The one on the right from Hayes, we have some interesting language, particularly associated with this thing called the Neptune. I found out that that is a particular piece of technology. Well, let's say my institution doesn't have a Neptune. So that is something that I'm going to have to rewrite. These are modifications that I have to consider. I also may find out that some of these other things I just don't do, or it doesn't align with my own policy or protocol. So I nix them. Okay then, now what? Now, what I want you to do is go back and look at the literature that these things are stemmed from. Go back and see if they talk about. Go back and see if the authors talk about validity evidence. It may seem like a lot of psychometric hoo-ha, but it will be interesting and it will be important to you, particularly in terms of internal structure. Oftentimes it's called reliability, and also this issue of generalizability. We want to see the sample and the breadth of who they use this assessment on, and I would like to have some ability to judge the validity of this tool to make inferences from the way that I'm going to use it at my institution. That's why you're looking at those things. We want to determine broad value, and we also need to consider local value. Perhaps it's perfect for your own institution or unit or learners, and perhaps maybe not, and we may want to look on. Looking on, now what do? We have these 2 scales. So we've already determined that on the first scale, we may have some items that work, may have some that don't. On the other one, it works pretty well. So let's say we take some from one and we make the other one the primary assessment tool. That's okay. We're going to get rid of that one. We've added them. Let's say we've combined some items and we ultimately have this final, in air quotes, assessment tool. What do we do with that? Well, now we take it to a focus group, and ideally that focus group is going to have some recording, either videotape, audio tape, and at a bare minimum, I really think you need a note taker to identify the folks that suggested the changes and how many people agreed with it. Seems a little onerous, but believe me, you will appreciate this later when editors, when you're submitting this assessment down the road, want to know about how you ensured content validity. Those notes are going to be important. So what do we do now? Well, we have our assessment plan that we originally developed a priori. We have this assessment tool with maybe some additional items. That's totally cool. We look at this, we identify the critical items that are already on that instrument. We identify critical items that are new. Maybe we missed something and we need to add them, particular for our own institution or learners. Also, I like to have people look at non-critical items. Sometimes there's a consistent assessment and capturing of low ability. Remember, we talked about that bottom tier of the pyramid? Maybe we don't need them. And I prefer to remove some of them. If we know that 100% of your learners will know how to do item 23, sometimes it's okay to remove item 23. That's done via consensus, though, and that's why you have a focus group to determine that. Okay? We also remove non-relevant items. Sometimes we have something that folks wanted at their own institution that may not be relevant to you. Take it out. It's too distracting for the assessors. Okay? You also need to identify the best scoring rubric for your assessors and your learners. If you want formative feedback, maybe that anchored 3-point scale is very helpful. But if you have assessors that rotate through every week or every couple months, maybe just a dichotomous yes or no is appropriate and easier to understand for your instructors. Just something to think about. The other thing that I'd like you to note is we have to determine sometimes the organization of items. Sometimes it's chronological and it's a process flow. You go from step 1 to step 5 to step 8 and so on. That makes total sense. Now, sometimes in performance assessment, you have subdomains like procedural skills. That goes in one subscale. Maybe you have communication skills or leadership. Those are still psychomotor type of domains that need to be addressed potentially. So perhaps you want to break those out into a leadership and communication or process and communication. Now, finalizing your items and your metrics. We have our scale. You think you've got your assessment tool all designed. You've gone through your process. You've removed non-critical things. You've added critical things. You may have reorganized for your own process. Fantastic. Are you done? No. What I think you should do now is step away from it. This has been your baby from the beginning, and you have to kind of give it up for a little bit and have someone else review it. Ideally, someone that has experience in assessment or maybe even education that's not a clinician, because they're going to look at it with a different set of eyes. They'll review for clarity till they understand it. And they'll also check to ensure items are discrete unless they're required. And what do I mean by this? Let's look at item 26 on Hayes' scale. I'm going to blow it up. I'll read it. After abdomen closed, designee, RN, nurse, or surgical tech weighs uterine expression, clots from drape, blood on floor, and records in QVL calculator. Now that is one giant item, but after discussion with the clinicians and by consensus, they agreed all of that is done in one cognitive process. This is the one time that I agree that chunking items is important. And in this case, they either did it all or they didn't do it all. And that was the critical decision. So sometimes those decisions are made, and that's okay. Just depends on what you, as a clinician, and what you want the learners to be able to do. That's how we organize it. Okay. The other thing you need to do after this other person, this non-clinician, reviews it is have your SIMS specialist, either a technician or the manager, have them review it to ensure the checklist items align with required resources. What do I mean by this? If one of these items requires you to set something in a simulated computer algorithm or on the machine or on a device, and that device can't do that task, you can't assess it properly, and it creates frustration. Does that make sense? So make sure that whatever the person is doing, the learners are doing, and they are going to be assessed, that each one of those items can be done in the simulated setting. Sometimes we have to let items go because a simulator cannot adequately represent the process flow. Sometimes you have to replace it with a think aloud, and that's done as well. Now that we have all our items, you're going to do one more step. If you really want to make sure you're being good about the item development, and I mean that in air quotes, this is time, it's a balance of time. One more step. You've removed all the items. Now we're going to disseminate your scale beyond just you. Ideally, amongst other faculty in related disciplines, but maybe not the same. We would like to do certain things to evaluate the generalizability. Again, this is to ensure content validity. I'm going to make a note here. If we can capture different specialties and have them evaluate these items, and if we know what level of training they've had, we know their expertise in that particular procedure, we can substantiate their decisions about using this tool for a particular use. Again, this supports the validity argument, particularly with generalizability. The other thing that we do here is we give people the opportunity to add one more task or remove one more task, and we rate these different items. And what we do is we have our group of folks come through, make edits. We take the means of their scores. We have the ratings on the top. And anything less than a mean of 2.5, which aligns a hair over not sure the step is critical to procedure, possibly include, we remove those. And those that score equal or greater than 2.5, we keep those and include those in the scale. This process is important for ensuring instructor agreement and buy-in. It also documents the formal item development process. This gets lost in the weeds very quickly because there's oftentimes many, many iterations and revisions. Here we go finally to disseminating your tool. You've created this fantastic thing. You're not quite done. After you've double-checked by instructor consensus, you may need to revise again. You may need to go through and do that content validation again. Sometimes it's overkill, and you can just have it reviewed by a few close-armed colleagues for final pass, and that's okay. Then we finalize the form. Most important, what I cannot minimize, is you must train the instructors and the assessors on this tool use. If you want good outcomes, and I don't mean good like everyone does well, if you want effective measures from this assessment tool, you have to ensure that everyone using it as a tool is using it the same way. That's reliability. That's important, okay? Then you fully disseminate it either to the program director, and they control the dissemination and make sure that everyone has the latest version of the tool. Very nice to say that this process I've used for a number of years, and it really is a sustainable way that is standardized, yet it's still responsive to your evolving goals, particularly changing learning objectives, and the training and assessment plans that do waver over time as you improve your curriculum. Most importantly, it does aid in developing a defensible and practical performance assessment tool. Here are the references if you would like them. If you need help or have any questions, certainly, feel free to contact me.